Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, a historically humanist congregation, and this is Coffee and Wisdom. This week, we're going to be thinking about rethinking what we need. Last week, we talked about the idea that humanity probably ought to come to terms with the idea that we're pretty well on our own in making decisions on the planet about how we can survive. So this week, what does that mean in terms of going forward? What are some ideas for ways that we can survive on the planet? Many argue that we do indeed live in the Anthropocene. That is relating to or denoting the current geological age viewed as the period during which human activity has been the dominant influence on climate and the environment. So in other words, we probably have reached a point in which humans are changing the environment more than anything else. And so what are we going to do about that? Because things are not looking up for us on the planet. Well, last week I talked a little bit about object-oriented ontology. That's a Western way of coming to the idea that human beings are not at the center of the natural world and all things else circle around us and to be used as we wish, but rather we are within that circle of living things all the way down to the stones and the trees. And notice I say down because that's the way we have traditionally thought about it. I also talked a little bit last week about the idea of going from centralized to distributed systems. This is very basic to the idea of how object-oriented ontology changes the way that we think. So it's a new, for Westerners, way of thinking in which everything from philosophy to economics. And the idea here is that, no, there isn't a center for the universe, for living things, for anything, but rather we're moving toward a place in which all things are netted together, as Darwin once put it, in a network of mutual survival or not. It would be the point there. In this, we are going toward, interestingly enough, animism, which is probably the oldest of the human religions. Religious naturalism, which is a movement that occurs among secular people for the most part. A lot of humanists are religious naturalists. That is the idea that nature itself is sacred. And by golly, that goes all the way back in the way that human beings have been thinking. The founder of religious naturalism, Ursula Goodenow, said the religious naturalist is provisioned with tales of natural emergence that are, to my mind, far more magical than traditional miracles. Emergence is inherent in everything that is alive, allowing our yearning for supernatural miracles to be subsumed by our joy in the countless miracles that surround us. That's part of growing up as human beings. One of the books I do want to cover this week, not today, is a fairly new one by Robert Putnam. You recognize his name from Bowling Alone, and also a book called Grace, which looked at the changes in American religious ideas. I noticed that the New York Times called him the poet laureate of civil society. This newest book talks about how we came together a century ago and how we can do it again. Again, communal action as opposed to egotistical self-perpetuation here. His argument in the book is that we went from an I in the original U.S. understanding of how to be individuals in the world and taking resources to a we in the late 19th century that lasted up until the Second World War and has now dissipated back into an I again. And how did that happen? We've talked about that in terms of the ideas of how a mainline religion developed in the later 19th and early 20th century. And Putnam is looking at it from a slightly different angle, but a very interesting book to talk about communal living on our planet. Today, I want to very quickly consider a book called Donut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist by Kate Rawhirth. This was published in 2017, not that long ago. It has now been translated into 18 languages and counting. Very important book and probably a watershed moment in thinking about economics in this newer way of seeing a networked way of living in the world. You can find out lots at her website, katearoth.com, and she's great, and you can find her all over the web. She was born in 1970, still very much alive, and an economist at Oxford University's Environmental Change Institute, co-founder of Donut Economics Action Lab. And again, she is quite the consultant, although she is a professor at Oxford and also at Cambridge. So she does get around spreading this idea of donut economics. She goes back in this book and begins by looking at a book from 1960 called by W.W. Rostow called The Stages of Economic Growth, a Non-Communist Manifesto. 1960, of course, is the Cold War. How do we have a capitalist economy as opposed to a communist economy, and how do we beat the communists in the economic gain is basically the idea. It's very much politics as well as economics. Rostow was an economic advisor to John F. Kennedy in his 1960 election bid, and Kennedy was promising a 5% economic growth in the first year of his presidency. That's a fairly big economic growth. That's up toward what China has been doing up until the pandemic. So a very big chunk of economic growth. How were they going to do that? Well, Rostow had this idea of how economics works. One is the traditional society. These are the folks that live off the land, very much planted in place. And he was dismissive of this idea of how human society could work because it doesn't generate enough wealth in Rostow's idea. So then he talks in the book about the preconditions for takeoff, drive to maturity. And his final stage is the age of high mass consumption. This is the goal of his economic pattern. And this has become the goal of American politicians ever since, is to achieve and then now sustain an age of high mass consumption. There's no discussion of how to find the resources to make high mass consumption a reality. And this, of course, is the problem with this economic model. It's only growth for growth's sake. So even, she says, anyway, conventional economics, even enlightened conventional economics, ask, how do we build a sustainable economy, ignoring always resource limitations? And that's a problem even when we begin to talk about sustainable economies, which, of course, often we don't talk about according to which political party happens to be dominant in the United States at any particular time. How does this work? Well, her central idea is this: we must balance essential human needs with our planetary boundaries. That's why she calls it a donut, is that the outer edges of this is as far as our resources will allow us to go. When we push out any farther outward, we run into disaster. Economic systems, she argues, must be designed to thrive, not to grow. We've got to forget about this high mass consumption growth idea and figure out how to make an economy thrive, and therefore the human beings within the economy thrive, and also the planet itself. So to be very basic about the donut idea, we have planetary boundaries. After we go past those boundaries, we start burning up resources that don't come back. So we have to live within those planetary boundaries if we're going to survive as human beings, is her argument. But also, yes, we need within our economies to fulfill basic human needs. We need to stop harming people, which the current economic patterns worldwide do, and begin to meet basic human needs. That's the idea. And this is the more complex way that she looks at the donut of economics. Right now, in the center, we have a shortfall. We do not serve all human beings on our planet. How do we figure out a way to do that? And then she draws up ideas of the social foundation, the very basics of making any society work. And that would be food, health, education, income and work, peace and justice, political voice, social equity, gender equality, housing, networks, and energy. How do we get all of those things to begin to balance, and so that we don't break through to this biodiversity loss, loss of land by overexpansion, nitrogen and phosphorus loading too much into the atmosphere, et cetera. And these go on and on. Ocean acidification, not yet a tragedy, but we're on the way toward that tragedy. Ozone layer depletion, air pollution, et cetera. If you want to learn more about her ideas, she has a great TED Talk online. A healthy economy should be designed to thrive, not grow. Just look up TED Talk and Kate Rawhirth, and you will find that. It has had millions of views. Lots of people are interested in figuring out how do we do some kind of sustainable economy to save ourselves on our planet. One of the ideas that comes out of her book that's becoming very popular in Europe is the idea of circular cities. And many European cities have signed on to the Circular Cities Declaration. There's also a declaration for business owners, and within that, which the focus there is culture and capabilities, leverage internal mindsets and strengthen the company's collaborative innovation competencies to accelerate the transition to a circular economy, and solutions within business boost concrete business projects to foster solutions meeting circular economy requirements. Very few American corporations have as of yet signed on to this. Johnson & Johnson has, a Wisconsin company, family owned, as has Google, but very few American companies have signed on to the idea of doing some sort of circular economic growth. This is the basic idea of a circular city. We have the city, and guess what? Cities produce waste. How do we deal with all of that waste of very many kinds? And the idea is to ultimately, through recycling, get back to where most of the energy is being produced from the waste. Up to about 75% is the goal of the circular cities when cities sign on. About 75% are from some sort of sustainable energy production. So that's the idea of saving ourselves by these large urban areas signing on to an idea of living within the donut of our economics and our resources on this planet. And you'll notice that if you begin to do web searches on this idea, what you're going to find fairly often, to get right back to the idea of religious ideas, philosophical ideas, is you're going to see a lot of symbology that's kind of recognizable, in that they are based in very old ideas of religion that are compatible with the idea of sustainability and circularity. So keep an eye out for that. It's interesting when old religious ideas begin to inform newer economic and business ideas. Well, that's what we've got for today, and what we're going to be dealing with this week is how can we figure out how to live on this planet now that we have seen the outer boundaries of where we can be. Thanks a lot for listening, and if you have some time, definitely go to YouTube and become a subscriber to First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis. That is our main channel where we have our assemblies, and the one this is on, Den of Conversation, a humanist channel. And thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again tomorrow.